Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is John Lyndon Sia. You can call me Lyndon, and this is my synthesis presentation for Research 290. This is for chapters 1 to 10. Before I start off with the research proper, we're going to go over the table of contents so that you could see what the contents of my presentation is, and you could just skip through the video if you'd so desire. So the first would be the introduction, a short but sweet introduction of the entire synthesis. Next would be knowing the basics, what makes up a research, what are the frameworks, what are its parts, what are the processes that make up research. The next would be what makes a researcher, what are the skills, the ethics or the practices, and even the philosophies that would make a good researcher. Afterwards, we're going to help create the research proposal and the related literature evaluation. Afterwards, we're going to evaluate the literature through the literature review. We discuss, we even elaborate the important critical questions that we need to use and we need to be mindful of when evaluating our literature. The next method would be the methodology. So this is where we speak of the methods, what are its intricacies, what are some important considerations, and what are some things that we need to know about methodology as a whole. Next, we're going to be collecting data. Since we know how we're going to design our research, we're going to figure out how are we going to collect that data. Are we going to get qualitative? Are we going to get quantitative? Well, it's up to you. Next would be the observation. We're going to take a deep dive into observation. What are its uses, what it's for, and what is it good at and what it's not good at. Finally, we're going to go through the concluding statements of the report. And last but not the least, references if you want to do further reading and some checking on my work. So to start off, here's the introduction, getting to know what it's all about. The pursuit of knowledge and wisdom will always be one of humanity's most noble endeavors. So, in a way, research is the scientific method that is elaborated and expounded in detail. I think Homer there would agree. So, what is this cycle of research? So, first of all, as someone who is curious or just someone who simply asks a question, gets an idea, that person is already in the conceptualizing stage. So this is where a researcher would start with an idea and asks, how will this idea be solved? How will this idea be expounded? So the researcher starts to refine that idea, and this is the conceptualizing phase. Afterwards, the researcher would go then ask, how am I supposed to investigate this idea? So we have the planning area where a researcher would sift through different related literature and related studies. So now that the researcher has a plan, how he has an idea on how to do things, now they're going to go about conducting the research. This is putting the theory to the test and gathering data to understand the idea better. And finally, since you have all the data on hand, you're going to start analysis. So you're going to make sense of everything that happened. You're going to apply everything you've learned from the related literature and everything that you've gathered from the data. So you're going to analyze everything. You're going to make sense of what just happened. So, knowing the basics, research is composed of frameworks. So the first one would be the conceptual framework. So this is where the general idea of the research resides. So this is where the keywords, statement of the problem, main objective, and specific objectives are elaborated, as well as the scope and limitations of the study. This is quite important to get right in the earlier parts of your research, because if the researcher truly believes in that idea, then the following theoretical framework would be a smooth sailing boat. Hopefully. Because in the theoretical framework, this is where the researcher would evaluate the theories, the concepts, the related literature, like publications, studies from other researchers, and related studies as well. And this is where you conduct literature review, where you showcase everything that you've researched so far, everything that you've understood, and you're going to put it into one very condensed paragraph, and you're going to tell them what you've learned and why it supports your case. The methodological framework, on the other hand, is the design of the study. This is where the researcher would collect the data and meet the specific objectives that were mentioned in the conceptual framework. And finally, we have the analytical framework, where, from its name, the researcher would make the analysis, creating new knowledge out of the knowledge that you've gathered from the theoretical framework and your methodological framework. And hopefully, this knowledge would be added to the greater body of knowledge and further contribute to humanity's development. So, the pursuit of better understanding. Now, not all researches were created equal, and not all researches were seen through the same lenses. So, there are research paradigms that a researcher needs to take note of, and one of them would be positivism. Society is structured and studied through the natural science only. Interpretivism, on the other hand, values quality over quantity and believes that things happen for a reason. And the third one that we have is social constructivism, which is that experiences are a collective idea and the experience of many. So a lot of things that happens in reality stems from human interaction and the social responsibilities that we have for one another. So what makes a researcher, What are the skills, the ethics, the practices, the philosophies that makes a researcher? So in the book that was created by Dr. Silva in 2016, he elaborated further on research skills. And according to that book, here are some skills that are important for a researcher. One would be creating ideas. Next would be classifying, sourcing, and using the appropriate literature. It is followed by the development and the improvement of research projects with a good fit. That is followed with the collection, the analysis, and the interpretation of data. And most importantly, a research skill that is important is the ability to write well. So, how do those research skills connect with the research phases? So, the first research phase would be the creating of ideas and concepts. So, this is the conceptual framework. Heading back to the previous chapter, a researcher that has the skills of creating new ideas and concepts would greatly intersect with the conceptual framework, because you're creating ideas and you're conceptualizing the entire research idea that you have, followed by pushing towards the realization, which is the theoretical framework. So you classify, you source, you find the proper literature or the proper study that can support your document, that can support your idea so that it would hold water. The following then would be interpreting the facts, which coincides with the methodological framework. So this is where you collect, you interpret the data, and how it coincides with the literature that you just had read in the theoretical framework. And finally, utilizing that knowledge. The researcher paints a clear picture and contribute new knowledge to the discipline that you have. So the very big thing that Dr. Silva mentioned or put emphasis on would be researchability. So, researchability is simply how researchable is your idea. So, what are some things that we have to take note if your research is in fact researchable? So, one would be, is the data available? Do I have access to the data? The next would be, do I even like my research idea? I mean, I might have chosen this idea because this is what my bosses told me, but do I even like it? Am I being too ambitious? Am I trying to find the key to nuclear fission? Or maybe even finding a new crystal as a fuel source? And finally, does the research have enough time? Do I have enough time? And apparently, nobody in the world has enough time. So you got to make sure that you have enough time to finish your research. So the research statement. So the research statement breaks down the topic into its fundamental parts. This lays the groundwork of the goal of the researcher, the scope, and some of the problems to address. In essence, the research statement is a simple statement of the entire research project. It contains the keywords, the key concepts, and the scope of the study, as well as its limitations. For example, this research project is an analysis of utilizing byproduct brine from a geothermal system supplemented by a solar collector for an organic Rankine cycle in Palimpinon 1, Valencia, Negros Oriental. How about the research aims and objectives? So, with your research statement in place, we now have to develop the main objective, which is the MO, and the specific objectives, which is how the research plans to achieve the research, which is also called the SO. Now, a good tidbit from Dr. Silva's book, where he explains how to use Bloom's taxonomy. So just like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Bloom's taxonomy shows the hierarchy of verbs and how it presents a better picture. So by using Bloom's taxonomy, researchers can apply the proper words to best describe your efforts on conducting the specific objectives. So for example, running back to the geothermal system that we just mentioned earlier, the aim of this research then is to create a simulation model of a hybrid geothermal and solar system that utilizes brine byproducts for geothermal steam fields and recover heat to power an organic Rankine cycle. And what are some examples of the specific objectives? One would be to develop a simulation model of using a hybrid system of geothermal and solar collectors to power eventually an organic Rankine cycle power plant. The second objective would be to evaluate the amount of possible heat recovered from the byproduct brine as well as heat added from the solar collectors. Now, sourcing the research literature. The internet is quite a beautiful place, but the thing is, you have to verify everything that you find there. So, what are some things that you need to source? What are some things that you need to take note when you're sourcing your literature, not only from the internet, but from libraries and even government agencies and other institutions? First one would be the publication date. The researcher needs to ensure that the date of publication is not less than 5 years. Having a research that was created or that has its publication date not less than 5 years ensures that the data that was created there or the data that was stated in that study is still updated. And it's not some random numbers that were inputted in that study. Then we have to assess the author's credentials. By having an author who is experienced in the field and also has the years and outputs to show for it would instill confidence and reliability when we're going to assess their work and This is going to instill confidence in us as well when we're going to use their research. Finally, the place of publication. Just as we assess our author's credentials, it is just as important that we find out the place of publication as well, because this is going to be another source for reliability and validity of the research. Critical paper analysis. So when we're sourcing our research literature, no matter how good something sounds, it's always best to figure out the strengths and weaknesses of the paper that we're reading. There are some papers that we may be reading and that may look good at the first try, but as soon as we keep on reading through it, we would figure out where their research greatly lacks at, and this could be points where we could put improvements, and this could be some applications that we could put as well for our research, or we can also improve upon. So referencing the sources. The act of proper referencing or citation is the greatest respect a researcher can render upon another researcher. By doing this, we recognize their efforts for their study as well as their contributions in providing more knowledge to the field of study. So it's very important that we reference the sources, because if we don't, we're going to be accused of plagiarism. So some important questions that we could ask ourselves when it comes to plagiarism is that, did I give the proper reference? Did I paraphrase their work, or did I just copy paste it? Did I organize a list of all the sources I used? I may have scoured through the internet, through the different libraries, but I forgot to source some of it, and I may have claimed that this tidbit of information was something that I found. Did I make that list? And is there a software that I can use that could instill confidence that I could use it to check my work for plagiarism? It is really quite important for us to avoid this, because this is one of the biggest sins that we could commit in our research. So by proper referencing, we can really avoid plagiarism, while at the same time, this is going to instill confidence in people who's going to read our research that we did our homework and we properly cited it as well. So creating the bibliography is basically all of the published work that was used in the research project. This may include, but are not limited to, books, reports, government publications, theses, and the appendix, on the other hand, are the documents that are used to provide detail to the study. So this could be letters from stakeholders or raw data from the field. So these are just some examples for this. And research ethics. So boiling down the research ethics, as mentioned by Dr. Silva, we get two very important traits, which is beneficence and non-malfeasance. Beneficence is where the researcher puts the welfare of those involved in the study first, while non-malfeasance is that those involved in the study shall not be harmed. So it's as simple as that. If we keep these two traits in mind, we're going to have a smooth time. So here are some ways for us to practice ethics in our research. The first one would be to maintain confidentiality. Our participants must always be informed before they make their decisions. And through this information, we also guarantee that whatever they answer to us or whatever data they give to us, it will always be maintained confidentially. There are some limits to confidentiality too. So if the person could be in harm's way, confidentiality could be breached via duty of care. So this is still in line with beneficence and non-malfeasance, where we put the welfare of our subjects first, and we also do no harm to those involved in the study. The third would be, we could make sure that our participants are comfortable. So our participants are not required to do anything or answer anything that they're not comfortable with. The fourth one would be to give the proper debrief. By properly giving debriefs to our participants, we remove any anxieties or any misconceptions towards our research. At the same time, we give them a sense of dignity, knowledge, and that the time that they spent here was not wasted. Now that we have the data, some practices that we can consider would be data storage and security. So we first must always evaluate who has access to this data. We also have to keep note of hard notes or hard copies of notes, paper interviews, and even soft copies of the recordings as well. We have to know who has access to this data, and we have to find ways to properly secure it. We have to also consider backups as well. And finally, when analyzing this data, we have to anonymize this data. We remove direct identifiers that may identify this certain trait to our participant, and we only take the data that we need to ensure that we remove any distinctions for the person. We also have to very we also have to be very careful when we're dealing with quantitative data, because there are times where certain traits that are unique to one person, even if we may remove some data, someone who is smart enough can pinpoint these characteristics and may reveal the identity of this participant. So now we proceed to creating the research proposal. So how we make the proposal and how do we evaluate the related literature. Before we start with creating the proposal, we first have to discuss the different epistemological situations that we may find ourselves in. So as a researcher, there are different lenses that we view the natural world. So through these perspectives, this can influence our view on reality, and at the same time, this can also influence how we conduct our research. The first of them would be positivism, which is the belief that everything is unique, reality is unique, and there is distinct, and it is also distinct from consciousness. So, how does one who views the world through positivism conduct research? They do this by using different quantitative methods that offer a good representation of the population. The second one would be social constructionism, which is more emphasis on the collective side of humanity. It uses a combination of both qualitative and quantitative methods, and the focus there is more on the individual experiences of persons. And lastly, interpretivism, which is that reality is a normative construction subjected to the different interpretations and socializations. So different ways to conduct interpretivism would be different qualitative ways, such as interviews, group observations, and even focus groups. Now, what are some philosophical frameworks that can be used to supplement our epistemological views? Functionalism explores the different social structures and its purpose to society in general. Feminism, on the other hand, is a movement that aims to provide equal rights and opportunities to both men and women. Critical theory, on the other hand, is the societal review and criticisms with a perspective to revealing systems of domination. Now that we've discussed that, we can also move on to the five basic elements of a research proposal. The first one would be methodology, then it is followed by the epistemology, then the methods, then the ontology of the research, and finally, the theoretical perspective. As you can see here, we have the methodological pyramid that was taken from a book that was written by Dr. Silva. So the very base of this pyramid, which is also called the methodological pyramid, is the fundamental philosophies, which are the positivism, constructionism, functionalism, and in the middle of the pyramid would be the different research methodologies like survey, case studies, experimental design, textual analysis, and at the very top would be the data collection methods, which are observation, questionnaires, interviews, focus groups, all that stuff. So through this methodological pyramid, we researchers would be guided on how we could create our methodology and to the extent our methodological framework. Now, how does theory affect research? So theory is a collection of concepts that has been reviewed upon an established body and has been adopted to an extent to explain a certain phenomena, kind of like the theory of relativity, for example. So, what importance does theory provide to research? So, the very first one would be by applying theory to your research, there are different perspectives and analysis on the framework of the research, especially when there are differing views. By employing theory as well, you get fewer mistakes when solving certain problems, as it has become an effective tool for field development. And lastly, the general public is offered an explanation as to why a certain event or phenomenon may occur. So now that we've established the importance of theory, we can now move on to the theoretical framework. The theoretical framework then is the synthesis of the researchers' collected literature, as well as their own understanding of the situation. So how does one create theoretical framework? First one would be to locate the related literature and related studies, keeping in mind the different ways on how to source literature. Second, we are then to study, verify, and assess the paper. Afterwards, we add this paper to the short list of literature that we will consider for our research. And finally, we compile all of the literature and all the related studies, and we're going to use this to build our theoretical framework and create an argument for our idea. So, can one make their own theory? And as stated by Dr. Silva in 2016, theorizing data explains and shows how results and conclusions from a study help and oppose the present studies. With the analysis and interpretation of the collected data, the researcher can formulate their own theories that provide an explanation to the phenomena observed. So it is very important that the researcher does their due diligence to include the results of the published study for the literature review. So this gets us to the very cycle of research. A research that is grounded on theory by nature is a cycle. A theory begets an idea. This idea begets research. Research begets knowledge. And knowledge begets theory or another idea. It is a cyclical pattern. So this is where the beauty of research itself starts, because by being a cyclical pattern, we can continue to keep on verifying this knowledge that we have established, and we can be satisfied this knowledge is in fact true and can be widely adopted for future references. Now we head on to the literature review, how to critically evaluate the literature, how to discuss it, and further elaborate the literature to create a sound case for your study. So the very first thing that a researcher needs to do is to do their own part in determining that the research topic and the research question is something that greatly interests them. Like I've said in the earlier part of this video, it's quite important for the researcher to like the topic that they are researching, because this, by doing something that you don't like, this could become a big burden to the researcher, and this may be a cause of hindrance, or maybe even the cause for why the quality of the research degraded. So before we start with the literature, we first discuss and we first differentiate what a research topic is against a research question. So A good research question provides a well-composed paper, and this is because a good research question focuses on the issues that it wishes to address while providing evidences that support it. A research topic, on the other hand, is one that needs further refining, as the researcher still needs to narrow down in order to find the research question. So if you still have a research topic, you need to first refine it so that you can get that perfect or a good enough research question, which will be one of your basis for the research that you will be doing. So how do we formulate the research question? Here on the slide are some different ways on how the researcher can further elaborate on the topic. By narrowing down the research topic to the research question, this will greatly aid the researcher in conducting their research. So the first one would be to base the question on the purpose of the statement. Second would be to find multiple sources. Third would be to gather evidences for your research. Fourth one would be to create strong arguments from everything that you've learned so far. And the fifth would be to state the opinions, problems, and even provide discussions for the research question. So how do we further elaborate a topic if you only have a research topic? The first one would be self-introspection. You start by questioning yourself on why this topic is significant. Why do you why did you think that you could use this topic? The second would be to evaluate interest. So our research topic at first may sound very interesting to us. However, as we go on through the research and we start recognizing the things that we need to do, we may find that our passions may lie elsewhere. So after you perform a self-introspection, the second thing that we have to do would be to evaluate our interests, because this will be one of the driving forces that for a researcher to further their research and also helps in elaborating the topic. If the things that we are going through, the literature that we are reading is maybe too difficult, we can always approach our peers and advisors. By getting a different perspective on this certain topic, we can help keep the ideas flowing. And maybe a change of perspective was maybe all that we needed in order to tackle the research topic. And finally, if all else fails, the researcher can always develop better expertise with the topic. So this could be through by searching the latest developments or trends, or perhaps taking specialty classes to supplement the knowledge of the researcher. What makes a good research question? First one would be, can it be answered by researching for more data? If the researcher or if you can find more data, then you can definitely answer the inquiries that you've put on your research question. Although it is important to note that there are some limitations to this, like finding out the ethics, the religion, or maybe qualities of a certain object. The second would be, is it restricted and clear? So the research question greatly details the scope and limitation of the research in question. It carefully defines the words in the question to ensure that the reader evaluates the research question and there will be no doubt on the research question itself. The third one would be, are there enough results? So we may formulate our research question, but then how many other researchers conducted this study before? So will we have the available data? And then are there new views or new perspectives that we can integrate into our research? And finally, are the assumptions sound? The research question should have established the assumptions in order to further clarify the topic. So there may be some factors that we haven't considered to the ever-changing nature of the topic. And maybe and as we further through the development of the research question, there may be some initial assumptions that we considered that may now be obsolete by the time that we finish the research question. Now we head on to the review of literature. So by discerning through the different related literature and related studies, this is an essential skill that a lot of researchers need to develop and need to learn. I myself still need to develop this. And the review of the related literature and related studies would provide the much needed foundation that supports the topic and to an extent helps design the structure of the research itself. So any knowledge that we extract from the literature review should be made clear by making connections from the previous researches to our current study. So what are some important considerations for the literature review? The first would be define the main problem, the questions, and gaps in knowledge addressed by the previous sources. So there may be some topics or maybe some subsets of knowledge that doesn't have enough clarification or maybe even testing conducted. So this could be places where there are gaps in knowledge. The second would be familiar with key theories, concepts, ideas, and methods common to the studies. By being familiar to this, you not only give your research a strong foundation to stand up on, but by having the common methods used by those studies, the researcher can then be confident enough that they can choose from the different types of methodologies and use this to design their methodological framework in the next chapter. But for this case, knowing this is quite important. And finally, we have to verify our sources. By verifying our sources, we instill confidence as a researcher that the data that we're gathering was not made up and wasn't definitely cooked. Now, no matter how good that research may look like, we also have to be objective to it because by being objective, we can verify the strengths and weaknesses of that research. And this could be a very important stepping stone for as a researcher because this would be another angle to attack and another angle to address in the research that we will be making. So now with a conceptual framework created, the researcher now has a good grasp in the gaps in knowledge regarding to that particular topic. The researcher also has an idea on which aspects of the study to be targeted, which definitely narrows down the search for the related literature. So as we go through the different studies, the different publications, the different papers that we read through, there may be some themes that may come up with a certain subset of literature. So by knowing these themes, we can create connections from different literatures and we can also use this as another point or another way to boost the argument for our research. So sources for literature can vary widely depending on the medium used to locate the literature. Online databases of colleges and universities would offer researchers a very rich collection of studies conducted by their seniors or even their peers that in a way would offer an outlook or maybe a perspective of the topic of interest. So now that we've gathered their literature, how do we present it? So there are about four ways on arranging the literature. The first one would be chronological. The researcher takes into account the timeline of the discovery of knowledge. So, by being chronological, it doesn't necessarily mean you arrange the literature by the time you found it, and instead, the researcher would put the discovery of knowledge in chronological order. So they would start off with the first study that has established this knowledge. Then it would connect onto another study that further elaborates on the gaps of knowledge found in the first study. The second would be thematic. So the researcher organizes the literature through the different themes. So if you're taking on renewable energies, you could categorize your literature by doing solar, geothermal, and then wind. The third one is methodological. The researcher organizes through the progressive testing of different studies for the topic. This is quite important for someone who would be doing an experimental research because by categorizing your literature through the methodologies, one can elaborate and even evaluate the different ways that researchers had done in order to test a specific theory. So if you recognize a pattern in the methodologies, maybe perhaps it's time for a different way for the researcher to evaluate that idea. And finally, theoretical. In the theoretical, the researcher focuses more on the theories that each literature has explored and tested. So now we get to write the literature review. So the literature review is simply more than a researcher giving their thoughts on the sources that they've acquired. It also provides a textual map of thoughts, some connections, even key pieces of information that may help the study progress. The literature review also infuses the researcher's own knowledge with new understandings taken from different sources. So, by piecing together the different literatures, the researcher is able to gain knowledge and a different perspective. And through this, you can make an effort to relate the different key points of the related literature and provide an essential effect to the study at hand. Most importantly, the researcher must never forget to properly credit the authors of the related literature that has been referenced in their work. So a good habit would be to compile the references early in order to not forget the critical sources and claiming it as your own. So this would be a very bad thing. And by having that list, you get yourself covered and you also get to reference the different authors. We head down to the methodology, which is putting the method in scientific method since an Italian named Galileo Galilei dropped the ball on top of a tower. So this is the methodological framework and inside the research process. So the research process can also be found in a book that was written by Dr. Silva. So bringing back onto the earlier portions of this report or the video, we first begin with the idea, we refine that idea. Afterwards, we state the research question or the statement. Then we create the specific aims and objectives. Afterwards, we perform the literature review. This is where we collect different related literatures and related studies. And after collecting and evaluating these sources, we can now proceed to the methodological framework. And to an extent, we select the methodology that greatly applies to our research. And we also devise the different data and collection methods. So the methodological framework encompasses the methods that the researcher has to use that would give the best results that would address the needs of the conceptual and theoretical framework. The research methodology essentially details how the researcher aims to collect the data and analyze it afterwards. So this helps researchers structure the flow on how they would tackle the issue, and how they would on what to expect on the data to gather and how they would be collecting it. This is where you would also apply some potential analysis to so that the researcher can apply it on the data as well. So in a way, the research methodology answers the specific objectives discussed in the conceptual framework. So it is quite crucial that at this stage, the researcher is satisfied with both the conceptual and theoretical framework. This doesn't mean that the researcher no longer or cannot modify the conceptual and theoretical framework. This just means that with the if the researcher is happy with the conceptual and theoretical framework, then the methodological framework can proceed on smoothly. So we will now discuss the outline of the methodological framework. The methodological framework is a way for the researcher to answer the research question. So this correlates back to the literature that has been evaluated, and furthermore, the researcher outlines if the required data has to be qualitative or quantitative. So before we discuss on that, what is the difference between research technique and methodology? Research technique describes the possible ways a researcher may gather data. So this could be conducting interviews, or doing covert observations. While research methodology lays out the discussion and the logic behind the methods and tools used by the researcher. So, what are some important research methodology factors? The first would be, what is the focus of the research? By knowing the focus of the research, you get to base it, or you get to decide on the proper methodology to apply on the focus of the research. The next would be, is it based on the statement of the problem? So we may choose between different research methodologies, but we have to consider that if our statement of the problem only requires X, but our methodology can take Y, then we may have to evaluate further if that methodology is acceptable for or is congruent with the statement of the problem. The next would be what the type of data is needed. So some some methods or some methodologies are good at taking qualitative and quantitative. Some are good at taking both. So this would present some compromises to the research, and by knowing the type of data, you can streamline the methodology of the research. And finally, the researcher needs to evaluate on where the data is located, because sometimes the data that we may need would be located in another area, another city, or maybe even another country. So it may be important to reassess if the methodology is in fact viable for the research based on the location of the data alone. Going back then, we would see the methodological pyramid, with the base being the fundamental philosophies, and at the middle would be the research methodologies, which again would be the what the researcher would choose when creating the research. And finally, on the top are the different data collection methods that would support our research methodologies. We now head on to choosing the type of research to use for your methodology. Now, for this report or for this video, I have considered the types of research that will be most applicable to an engineering standpoint. The first one would be an experimental design. This aims to experiment with independent and dependent variables and their reactions to different tests, or maybe their reactions to the environment. So this type of research methodology is best administered in a laboratory environment where everything is carefully controlled. So through this method, a complex issue is broken down into several parts, and then by testing it, the researcher may find the desired effect by testing out the different variables. The next research methodology type is the action research. So the goal of this research is simple, and that is to take a particular sample, analyze its qualities such that the qualities that are found are desirable to the research are then enhanced. So this differs from an experimental design, because in the experimental design, your goal is to simply determine what its effects are to a certain variable. However, an action research, you're looking for a desirable trait, and you're finding ways to replicate and improve that trait as you do the research further. The next type would be survey research, where the researcher can tap into the different sample populations from there and collect the needed data to address a certain issue. So, if the researcher wishes to determine the different engineering management skills of different engineering and procurement and construction firms, then a survey research is the way to go. Case studies, on the other hand, provide a detailed analysis on a very specific situation or event. So, by conducting case studies, this is where the researcher can perform a deep dive into a very narrow topic. So, for example, a safety incident in your workplace. So by conducting a case study, the researcher can definitely pinpoint the events that led into that safety incident inside your power plant. So the next would be textual analysis. So this is the analysis of documents, symbols, language, and current text to obtain a clear image on how individuals will make sense of life itself. Kind of like internet memes and the effects of internet memes on teenagers or maybe students in online classes. And the last one that will be discussed today is archival research. So through this, a researcher collects secondary data that can be reinterpreted and analyzed in order to paint a better picture of the issue that the researcher wishes to address. And on to the methodological framework. So the methodological framework is born from the conceptual framework and to an extent the theoretical framework. So this details out the methodology, the population, the samples, and the methods of data collection, and even the ethics of the methodology itself. So its parts include the introduction, which provides an overview of the methodology that will be applied to the research. Next is the research methodology. So this provides the detail on how the researcher may go about conducting their research. This also provides detail on the group of persons that will be affected by the study. Next would be the sample. This is where the researcher would be detailing where they would be extracting data from. And finally, the sampling method, where the researcher describes the size of the population of the study and the possible margin of errors that may be encountered while conducting the study. The next part would be the data gathering methods. This is where the researcher elaborates on how the data will be collected. The next one is the validity and reliability of the data collection methods. So this is where the researcher would elaborate further on how to avoid errors in the data itself and the types of methods that the researcher may employ in order to increase the validity and reliability of their data. Now, there are some instances where the data collected may not be congruent with the study. So, it's important to also detail the triangulation where the researcher uses two different approaches in answering the research question. And finally, if there are issues, the researcher can also raise their ethics argument here, where they can address any ethical or moral issues that may arise from the study that they will be doing. So finding the perfect fit. So it's an important reminder that aspiring researchers must always reflect on the plan that on how they plan to address the problem. Sometimes, due to the ambitious nature of the work, the researcher may become overwhelmed later on with the extensive testing required from it. So, what's the difference between qualitative and quantitative data? Qualitative data deals with more abstract concepts like human emotion or perspectives, as well as the characteristics like color and appeal. Quantitative data, on the other hand, is simpler and aims to assign a specific quantity to a certain event. So, quantitative data deals more with numbers compared to qualitative data. And finally, collecting the data. Before knowing what the numbers mean, you first need to collect the numbers first. So, how does one choose about primary or secondary data, or what is even the difference between them? So primary data is data that's been obtained by the researcher from conducting the data collection methods themselves. So if you're conducting an experiment, you're getting primary data. Secondary data, on the other hand, is data that was created by another researcher and was taken by the researcher and incorporated to their study. So this could be an example would be taking or referencing data from a government agency and using that data for your study. So how is primary data obtained? So this is the observing and documenting of the event happening before the researcher. Through observation, the researcher may simply observe the participant or the event that is happening, and they would take notes on the event itself. So there are three types of observation that we could conduct. The first is participant observation, where the observer or the researcher participates with a group so that the desired event can be experienced by the observer. The second one is non-participant observation, where the observer observes the subject at the distance and is not directly a part of the event that is happening. Third is non-covert is covert observation, where the researcher observes the sample population without the sample population knowing that they are observed. Now, this method does raise ethical issues and must be used responsibly, but through covert observations, the researcher is the researcher doing the observation can produce a more authentic and more genuine response from their participants. The second way to obtain primary data is through interviews. So through this method, the researcher can be flexible on how the data can be gathered from the interviewee. Through this, the researcher can either demand or even reduce the amount of questions that they can give the interviewee, depending on how the interview would go. Finally, a questionnaire. So this is where a researcher would put in a set of questions that would be distributed to the target population. So an example with this would be conducting a research on the sentiment of parents and their children. And you can do this by distributing the set of questions during a parent-teacher meeting. So how is secondary data obtained? Secondary sources, on the other hand, rely on the researcher taking data from published primary sources. So secondary sources can include government or institutional publications, earlier research or studies, personal records, and mass media. So how does one go about defining their research population? The first one is homogeneous, where the population is the same. So, in from an engineering example, your population is all steel shafts. The next way of defining your population is through stratified. So through this, your population has layers. So going back to our earlier example, your stainless steel shafts differ from the different qualities. So there may be a high quality steel shaft and there's the normal quality steel shaft. The next is proportional stratified. Your population contains layers of known proportions like the amount of zinc stainless steel shafts have. The next would be you group your population by type. So the research population contains distinguishing characteristics or groups. So this could either be solid steel shafts, hollow steel shafts, keyed or non-keyed steel shafts, and the last one would be grouping your population by location. So the population is basically based on their location. So you could examine the steel shafts that were manufactured in the Philippines, in Singapore, and even the United States. Now that we know our research population, we now have to determine the methods of obtaining the samples. For the quantitative method, we have the random and probability sampling. The first one is simple random sampling, where the researcher simply picks from the sample population in random through either a lottery or a randomly generated number. A stratified random sampling is where the researcher collects its sample knowing the characteristics of the population that will be beneficial to the research. And finally, we have cluster random sampling, where the researcher groups the population via geographical locations and forms cluster where the sample population will be extracted from. So an example of this would be taking your stainless steel shafts in Manila and comparing those steel shafts from Cebu. So for the non-random, non-probability sampling, the first one is coded sampling. So the researcher simply bases the sample population to their ease of access. Simple as that. Accidental sampling, on the other hand, is also called convenience sampling, where the researcher performs the data collection that is convenient to them. So this could be in the streets or at the mall, or maybe even at school. Expert sampling is where the researcher mainly takes in the data from selected experts in the field. And finally, snowball sampling, where a researcher would collect data from a set of individuals and the researcher asks them to recommend another group of participants that wishes to become a part of the sample. So, qualitative research, obtaining data can greatly benefit through non probability sampling like quota, accidental sampling, expert, and snowball sampling. However, there are some caveats to this because there's no predetermined sample size for a qualitative research, and most of the sampling would be under the judgment of the researcher as to which individual or group would give the best information possible for their research. Now we move on to discussing further about secondary data. Secondary data is an important aspect to consider in research, as there will always be limitations that each researcher needs to consider when choosing their desired topic. So, some topics may require months of work, and since researchers are constrained by time, a researcher may find solace in finding data through secondary sources like abstracts, literature reviews, reference books, academic books, even textbooks. So, what are some reasons for a researcher to use secondary data? So, the first one is that it is abundant and readily available. So, as we've said earlier, time constraint is a really great factor for some researchers. So, by using secondary data, the researcher simply has to evaluate the different data that they've collected instead of having to go out and collect that data. The second one is extensive data coverage. So if the data that is concerned is sourced from government agencies or even institutions that regularly update and maintain their data, then you're going to have a pretty good track record for your secondary data because you know your data is reliable and valid. And the third one is that secondary data supports the primary data. Secondary data helps further on the analysis and understanding of the collected data because there may be some cases where the primary data is not sufficient enough to explain the situation. So by using that secondary data, you get a different perspective and you also get a better understanding of the overall situation. So what are some concerns with secondary data? So secondary data may use a different research framework. So this framework may not align due to the minute yet unique differences in your research. So for example, your secondary data is concerned with stainless steel shafts, which is also what you're researching on. However, their stainless steel shafts uses a different composition. So it may not directly apply to your own research. And the next concern would be that there are limitations to tailor fit to your own research. So some methods or tests done in the study may not entirely reflect your own study's own parameters. For example, you want to study the effects of titanium under compressive stress. However, the study that you found, to where you're going to collect your secondary data from, only conducted studies on tensile stress. So that's something that you have to reconsider. And finally, questionable data. Researchers still need to do their due diligence when evaluating secondary data. Not all data were created equal, and the researchers should always be critical when extracting data from these sources. So finally, a researcher really does need to take their time to evaluate all of the secondary data that concerns their study. Due to the abundance of data provided on the internet, one may feel overwhelmed to take in as many data as possible. By taking as many data as possible, you're going to give yourself a lot of things to work on. So you may be tempted to remove some data that you may think is not proper or is not useful to your research. But as you progress through your research, you find out that, oh, I really do need that data. Why did I remove it? Secondary data essentially gives a different perspective and sheds light to some event or some issue that the researcher wishes to address. So the researcher should also do their due diligence to properly manage the data, as the sheer amount may prove to be detrimental to the researcher, because instead of focusing on the data itself, the researcher focuses more on sifting through the different data, and as they do this, they may not be able to properly evaluate that secondary data. Now we're on to the deep dive into observation. Seeing is believing. So through observation, this is one of the data collection tools a researcher can use, and its utilities extend from being able to observe the sample population. So why would one continue, or why would one consider or not consider observation? The first is that through observation, the researcher can witness the events unfolding. So the events are directly unfolding through their eyes, and by doing this, they can easily extract the raw data from that event. However, this takes a lot of time and preparation, so observation may not be so good for those researchers that are under time constraints. So through observation, a researcher can produce both qualitative and quantitative data. Researchers would also take in a philosophy of social constructivism and recognize that there are different realities for different individuals. On the other hand, if a researcher would want to collect quantitative data, there needs to be a strict schedule and a strict control of variables in order to avoid errors in the data collection. In essence, a highly structured schedule is required in order to maintain the accuracy of the observation, to maintain the repeatability of the research. So, what are some types of observations? So, as discussed earlier, participant observation is where the observer or the researcher is part of the group that is where the event would eventually happen. The non-participant observation, on the other hand, is where the researcher is at a distance away from the participant group. So the researcher here merely observes and is not part of the event that is currently happening. Covert observation, on the other hand, is where the true intent of the researcher or the observer is not directly known by the participants. Through covert observation, the researcher may employ methods like video recording or audio recording, where the researcher is able to extract the genuine attitudes or behaviors of the participants for their research. So, what are some structures to observation? It's simply structured and unstructured. Through a structured observation, the researcher observes, identifies, or simply looks into the behavior of the event that they wish to observe, and they have a schedule or a structure that to follow when observing that event that they wish to discover or to which they wish to address. Unstructured, on the other hand, is where the researcher directly engages with the participant and uses their own senses to collect as much data as possible. So, what are some reasons to conduct observations? The first is that the researcher knows how an event happens. Second is the researcher knows why an event happens. Third is that the researcher knows how the environment influences the observed participant. And the fourth one is that the researcher discovers the true behavior and conduct of the participants. Now, observation is possible in a controlled means. In order to conduct this, there are several tools that the researcher can use to ensure that the data collected from the observation is as close to being free from error as possible. Through controlled environments, The researcher can prepare and create the initial conditions that may trigger the event that the researcher wishes to observe. So what are some observational tools? First one would be field notes. So this is your typical notepad or notebook where the researcher directly scribbles down anything that they see or anything that they observe. Second one is observational coding. This is where the researcher has a specific set of questions or a specific set of codes that describe exactly the certain parameters that may occur during the observation. And finally, audio and video recording. The researcher here can definitely replay the event that is being recorded. However, through audio and video recording, some of your participants may not reveal their genuine selves. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, through observations, a researcher can definitely understand and capture the exact content on social behaviors. So the researcher develops a first-hand experience on the event and how the event does play a role in influencing their decisions. In order to do observation, the researcher definitely needs to exemplify rigor. This is because through the strict scheduling and standardized means of testing, by conducting the observation, the results are kept accurate. The researcher performs the test scientifically in order to prove that the data is sufficient and valid. When in doubt, a researcher can implement a pilot study. So, a pilot study is an initial test based on the initial structure created. So, through the pilot study, a researcher can determine areas or weaknesses in their research, and they can improve upon this when they do implement it for the actual events or the actual observation that they are to conduct. So, what are some steps in conducting observation? First is establish your objectives. The researcher knows the specific event, the specific behavior, or even the specific phenomenon that is of interest to the researcher. Second is to gain access. The researcher needs to gain access to the community so that the community themselves are comfortable with the researcher, and having access as well offers the researcher different situations to observe the issue that they wish to address. The third one is to secure the tools. By deciding on whether to use notes, coding sheets, or to conduct audio video recordings, this will greatly help the researcher in optimizing their workflow. The fourth one is to observe the participants. The researcher then utilizes their senses to observe as much as they can on the events before, during, and after the observation phase. And finally, the researcher analyzes the results. The researcher must make the effort to critically ask questions like why the event happened, what were the factors that made the event happen, and what are some connections that the researcher can form when the event happened. And finally, the conclusion or the meta synthesis. Research is truly a worthwhile endeavor that anyone with a thirst for knowledge should try out. As the art of research matures, so are the methods, techniques, and even its structures are refined to better serve future researchers in aiding with their research. As such, researchers should always start with an idea that truly interests them by heart. The idea, regardless of its novelty, should be explored, hammered, refined, and polished until the researchers themselves are satisfied with how the statement of the problem, its aim, its specific objectives, its scope, and even its limitations have turned out. Every piece of literature and related study should be reviewed as because the researcher learns more and more. The better the theories to support the study, the better the understanding, and the better the preparation for obstacles along the way. Finally, the researcher decides the methods of data collection. Through here, The researcher establishes the philosophies that their perspectives would be based on. And then the researcher would choose the research methodology that greatly fits their research, followed by their desired data collection methods. So through here, they can decide whether they would want qualitative or quantitative data, or maybe a little bit of both if they so desire. And finally, some reference for you to read on to this chapter. So thank you everyone for watching through my report. I hope that you've learned something from my synthesis, and I bid you all a good day. Thank you.